How are you? I'm glad to meet you. Today's topic is God's covenant for Abraham. Chapter 5. The author is Abraham Park. The fulfillment of the in the fourth generation they will return here. In Genesis chapter 15 verse 16, God said, "Then in the fourth generation they shall return here." The fourth generation mentioned in this verse begins with Abraham. Let us examine how this promise is fulfilled. According to the genealogies, how many generations passed before they returned to Canaan? According to Moses's genealogy, at a sweeping glance, it appears that there were 8 generations from Abraham until his descendants returned to Canaan. This is because Moses was the 7th generation from Abraham. Abraham gave birth to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob to Levi, one of his 12 sons, Levi to Kohath, Kohath to Amram, and Amram to Moses. Exodus chapter 6 verse 16. With 2 months left before the grand entrance into Canaan, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 3, Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 1. From there, he looked upon all the land of Canaan and died. After his death, when the Israelites entered Canaan under Joshua's leadership, Moses' son Gershom entered Canaan. Exodus chapter 2 verse 22, 18-3. Thus, based on Moses' genealogy, it appears that the Israelites entered Canaan 8 generations after the covenant was ratified. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Amram, Moses, Gershom. Exodus chapter 6 verse 16. However, as discussed in chapter 2 of this book, it is erroneous to conclude that there were only 4 generations from Levi to Moses during the 430 years. It is more reasonable to assume that, similar to the ancient Near East practice of recording genealogies, there must have been generations omitted between the 4 generations. Therefore, there must have been more than 8 generations between Abraham until the entry into Canaan. According to Joshua's genealogy, which has no omissions, the Israelites entered Canaan after 14 generations. The following illustrates Joshua's genealogy from Abraham to Ephraim, and to Joshua. 1 Abraham, 2 Isaac, 3 Jacob, 4 Joseph, 5 Ephraim, 6 Beriah, 7 Resheph, 8 Telah, 9 Tahan, 10 Ladan, 11 Amihud, 12 Elishama, 13 Non, 14 Joshua, 1 Chronicles 7:20. According to the genealogy above, the Israelites entered Canaan 14 generations from Abraham. This is an exact calculation since Joshua, who carried Joseph's bones into Canaan, was from the tribe of Ephraim, who was a descendant of Joseph. Numbers chapter 13 verse 8. Thus, the prophecy, "In the 4th generation they shall return here," is not in agreement with Joshua's genealogy. How, then, is the prophecy, "In the 4th generation they shall return here," fulfilled? Who was the 4th generation? We have previously validated the claim that the beginning of the 4 generations is Abraham. Who, then, are the 3 generations after Abraham? And who is the 4th generation? Isaac, the heir of faith after Abraham. We have seen that Isaac inherited the faith and the will of the covenant from Abraham. This was proven from Isaac's total obedience on the mountain Moriah and his faith in his father, Abraham, and in the God of his father. Had he not inherited Abraham's faith, he would not have been able to obey in a situation where he would be killed as a sacrifice offering, at an age when he was strong enough to carry the wood for the offering. He could have resisted his father's attempt to bind him to the altar if he did not have faith. Genesis chapter 22 verse 9. In addition, Isaac was Abraham's heir whom God acknowledged. In Genesis chapter 15 verse 4, God said, "But one who shall come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." In Genesis chapter 17 verse 21, God also said, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year." Furthermore, Romans chapter 9 verse 7 states, "Neither are they all children because they are Abraham's descendants, but through Isaac your descendants will be named." That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is a word of promise, "At this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son." When God said, "Through Isaac your descendants will be named," he confirmed that Isaac was the true heir to Abraham's inheritance of faith. Jacob, the heir of faith after Isaac. Isaac's second son, Jacob, inherited the faith after him. Between Isaac's two sons, Esau and Jacob, Jacob obtained the birthright and the blessing of the firstborn. Genesis chapter 25 verse 22, 27-5, Malachi chapter 1 verse 2. Romans chapter 9 verse 10, and not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived by one man. Our father Isaac, for though twins were not yet born, and had not done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose according to choice might stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, "The older will serve the younger." Just as it is written, "Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated." Although Esau was the firstborn, he despised his birthright, Genesis chapter 25 verse 34, and did not receive the blessing of the firstborn, Genesis chapter 27 verse 23, which ultimately went to Jacob. Jacob became the heir to inherit the faith after Abraham and Isaac. This was the fulfillment of the revelation that his mother, Rebekah, received while her sons were in her womb, Genesis chapter 25 verse 23. It was also the result of the covenantal faith that Jacob, who enjoyed dwelling in tents, inherited after spending 15 years in the same tent with Abraham and Isaac, Genesis chapter 25 verse 27, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 9. As the third generation to inherit the covenant after Isaac, Jacob was a man of faith who had strong conviction in the covenant and expended his whole life for its fulfillment. For this reason, God said of himself, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," Genesis chapter 28 verse 13, Exodus chapter 3 verse 6, 4-5, 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 36, Matthew chapter 22 verse 32, Mark 12:26, Luke chapter 20 verse 37, Acts chapter 3 verse 13. This is evidence that God had acknowledged these three generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The author of this book is Abraham Park. Abraham Park was an acclaimed world-class theologian with remarkable pastoral spirituality. He had dedicated his entire life to prayer and the scriptures, having read the Bible over 1,800 times. Throughout his lifetime ministry, he was a true pastor who loved the church and the congregation like his own children. His daily schedule consisted of 2-hour prayers and 3-hour Bible readings, as well as continual preaching and evangelizing. With conviction that to die is to live, he did his best in his prayer life to God for 3 years, 6 months and 7 days in the deep mountains. When the sun set, he did nothing but pray. When the sun rose, he did nothing but read the Bible. Then, finally, a single ray of grace shone upon him. Throughout the powerful illumination of the Holy Spirit and by the grace of God, the scenes in the Bible unfolded like a panorama before his eyes. These scenes were written down on large arrowroot leaves which were bound with a twig. They were later transcribed onto paper bought from a village under the mountain every few months. This is how Abraham Park's sermons began. Many people are impressed by the Abraham Park as follows. How can a person love so many people? How can a person make such a big impact to so many people? He is so hardworking, never rest. He never ceased to pray. He deserves to be truly honored for his dedication for the church and the congregations. A true and faithful worker of God.